Hi, everyone. My name is Rajni, and I am the Executive Director for Yoga Service Council. And today, as part of our Yoga and Resiliency series, we are going to chat it up with Anjali Rao, who is a yoga educator. She lives in the beautiful California, and today we're going to learn more about Anjali's very powerful story about resiliency and hope. Anjali, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Rajni. Good to be here.
Very excited to chat with you. So let's get right into it. So Anjali, if you want to talk a little bit about kind of your childhood, where you grew up, how you grew up, siblings, family structure.
Sure. I grew up in Bangalore, India. I was born in Mumbai, grew up there, did my undergrad there. At 23, I moved to Portland, Oregon, did my master's in communication, and then got married to my now husband. My family structure is a pretty traditional in terms of the structure. 3 siblings, the oldest daughter. I think that plays a part on in how we look to ourselves as a sort of a leader of the pack. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then of course the immigrant story of trying to do the most, get the most out of the resources that are available to you. So it all plays a part into how we deal with whatever happens.
Yeah.
So that's where I am.
Awesome. So when you were in India before you came to Portland, the eldest child, I'm the eldest. We are always the experiment for our children. Doesn't matter what age in the world. Always the experiment, which is great. So when you were there in India and you had your siblings, what was it like, almost, if you remember, kind of like the day-to-day, or how the schooling system was like? What were some of the joys and some of the complexities when you were growing up there?
So Bangalore is a very metropolitan, very sort of a quote unquote westernized city, even back then, which was in the 80s and the 90s. So we grew up with a very anglicized way of looking at the world because our education system was very anglicized. And I think, and yet there was this dichotomy of a very, very traditional family structure. But my parents always encouraged us to be critical thinkers and consume whatever we are doing, either of culture or religion or anything, with sort of a questioning lens. And I think that has sort of shaped a lot of how I am right now and how I parent my children too. So there was always this open dialogue, and I wouldn't call myself a traditional Hindu kind of. I've always been encouraged to question everything, authority, power, everything, and I think that has played a big role. But at the same time, I always was, as a member of society, and the norms that we sort of buy into being a member of a certain society. Back in India, for example, I learned Indian cultural dance, Indian classical dance of Bharatanatyam and Kathak, where there was a very set protocol that we have to follow with our teacher, for example, or what we have to do, what we shouldn't do in a dance class. So things like that. I mean, those are part of the cultural norms that we think of as normal. And so that sort of becomes a part of who you are also. So there is a certain sort of a discipline that we are encouraged to follow with our learning, for example. And the rigor, the dedication that we are supposed to give to a certain practice, and the details, there are no shortcuts, things like that. So it's a pretty rigorous learning style that we are encouraged to have back in India. So I think that sort of has influenced how I learn and how I teach here. Yoga.
So yeah, and that's really, so I remember when we were talking about this earlier, when I lived in India for about 7 or 8 years, during those adolescent years where the hormones are like all over the place, which was, I think, intentional on my parents' part to send me there.
So, yeah, they're like, I'm done, you go.
Yeah, we have extended family, let them handle you.
Yeah, so, exactly.
And I remember when I was there for about 7 or 8 years, during those formative years, the hardest thing for me to adjust to was the discipline
Mm-hmm.
in schooling, the
Mm-hmm.
discipline in which that the tradition and the culture within the household was. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and even for me outside, I wasn't in Bangalore, but for me outside of the house in India, it was kind of similar to the tradition inside the house. So, it wasn't that kind of separate. So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, with the traditional Indian household, the discipline, the rigor, which is very Indian culture, if you do something, you dedicate yourself to it.
Yes.
And then you had a very an external environment that was westernized, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be safe to say that it was the critical thinking skills that formulated the bridge between the two?
Yes, because I think you learn how to flow between and be contextual about how you are in certain settings. So, for example, if I were to go to a temple, I would dress more traditionally. I would follow certain protocol because that's expected. It's an expected norm there. So those things are, and you don't disrespect old elder people. I mean, we can question them, especially at home, but then there is, you're still respectful of the way you question. So you cannot cuss at all, things like that. Whereas my children here in the US, I mean, they are American as any person here, and so they cuss, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to stop myself from reacting. uh, so it's one of those things that we are taught as people who grew up in India. Like, I think we talked about, Rajni, that there is so much of diversity, and we are so used to that vastness of human experience in India, because there is extreme wealth, there is extreme poverty, there is extreme, there is a lot of intense intellectualism that happens in India, as well as illiteracy, and so many shades of all of this in between. So we are sort of very used to traversing all these shades of humanity in India, and that's a part of who we are. It's very internalized, and I think that kind of also feeds into our own thought patterns on what is acceptable and what's not.
And I think another part of this is because India is so diverse. We were just talking about it, it's like every 10 miles there's something different food,
Yeah.
different dialect, different something, different clothing, that's
Yeah.
more popular. So it's so diverse on its own. And when you
Yes.
grow up there and you're
Yes.
adapting it, it's like you're growing up with a much broader field of perception and
Yes.
and broader field of
Like a
integration,
worldview.
a
Yes.
worldview. And I think
Yes.
that is such a treasure compared to when that's not readily available when you're growing up.
Yes. I
Well,
completely agree. And my parents, especially my mom, highly encouraged us to be of service. When you have something, and we were, in many ways very privileged in financially, uh, and we were never given things just because it was available or we could afford it. We were always sort of uh, taught that we have to share, that it's a privilege to have, that it's a, and you should take joy and pleasure with what you have, but also share with, with people who don't have access to education, for example, or access to feminine products, for example, so things like that. So it was very tangible, and I was always exposed to different women, especially women, uh, always giving that in.
you know, it's very interesting. And then I want to pivot a little bit to your teenage years, and then when you came to do your master's in Portland. I remember, and if you're comfortable talking about this, we'll talk a little bit about it, because I don't know what obviously it was for you, but I remember when I was, when I spent all my years in India, something like, and maybe because I was in Uttar Pradesh, in UP, it's like the largest state that's there, and it also has obviously the most poverty.
Yeah.
So the culture in UP is actually, not very modern,
Yeah.
comparing to like other cities in India as well. So I just remember when I needed to get my feminine products, or even like a shaver, for my
Yeah.
underarms, it would be a very like covert thing. You know, like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
supposed to know, it's supposed to stay within. And this is feminine products. We have our periods, this shit happens. We have a cohort of
Yeah,
women that are supporting us. However, it's not
yeah,
meant for the men to understand anything about it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
for me, that's how I understood it to be and what I experienced. What was that like for you? I'm curious about this topic. Yeah.
I think it was a bit of all of what you said. In the sense, I grew up with a mom, with my sister and me, and we are all very strong personalities. And so my brother and my father had no choice. It was all in their faces, and we still kind of joke about it. And we also grew up with a big cohort of cousins, very strong, you know, and diverse personalities in that. So it's the village. When the village is in a certain way, then you sort of, that shapes who you are. And I'm not saying it was all, you know, wonderful and great. There is a lot of chauvinism, and it's so inherent and it is so insidious that you don't really pick on it until you're actually out of the system, and then you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that was kind of chauvinistic, you know. But back then, that was all we knew. And so it's all of that. It's not it's not black, you know, it's not one or the other. It's all of that.
And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. It's like there's so much to experience when you are living in India, when you're living in other countries. There's so much that you're absorbing and processing when you're living there. It's almost like the codes, you know, the different codes that kind of feed into your brain.
Exactly.
You know, very diverse. And I think there's dealing with that and understanding that, like we talked about earlier, is not only broadening the perception, but it lends to the gradual buildup of what strength may be. So when you think back in those moments and those times, do you feel that there was something about the inherent building of strength, you know, whether it was a strong woman, you know, what was that like?
I think growing up in a place like India, like I said, when there is so much of an exposure to everyday poverty or everyday people who have a lot, and middle class, and it's a burgeoning middle class in India too. So so when you see all these economic disparities so openly, some may find it sort of, you have to sort of desensitize yourself. But the way I look at it is, it has also helped me understand the amount of suffering that there is in the world, and what people do to live with it and maybe overcome it if they are so you know, in situated, or if something happens in their circumstance and something shifts. But I've also seen people who have never sort of gotten away from cycles of poverty and things like that back in India. So that kind of helps you to see from another perspective and even empathize more with people who have less, and have been in pretty powerless situations. And you see it when you see it very closely, intimately, um, you realize that the human spirit uh, is resilient. It is resilient not because we, you know, we should suffer, but that we have, and that we do, and that we can overcome it.
Love it. Thank you. I can't wait to quote that when we spread your video around to everyone. I love it. Okay, so what prompted you? So let's fast forward a little bit. So what prompted you? What was the impetus to come to Portland to do your education?
I have no idea. I was 23. Even back then, I mean, I got married and then I came to India, but to the US. But I had always this thing in my head, and it was all I think the books that I read and the movies that I saw, that this US is this place of milk and honey. And I wanted to be independent. I wanted to kind of be away from the family structure, like, you know, do my own thing. And somehow the US seemed to be a beacon of all of that. And so when my husband moved to Portland, he was always there, and then I came there, and then I did my master's, like I said, over there in communication. Again, no idea why. I went to one class, and the class was in intercultural communication, and I loved the teacher. And I said, I want to do my master's there. My undergrad was in microbiology, which was completely different. But I knew I did not want to be in a lab. I wanted to be with people. So I took this class and I really enjoyed the critical thinking part of it, the critical race theory, things like that. I really enjoyed it. It spoke to me. So I did my master's along with, they used to have this wonderful program of teaching undergrads, and they gave you scholarships free. And I had to teach undergrads and do my master's. And it was one of the best experiences ever, because the more you teach, the more you learn. You cannot teach and not learn. So I learned about the urban culture in Portland, for example, because that's who I interacted with every day. And I would have never had that experience as an immigrant in my 20s if not for that. So I really understood, I got to see the different shades of the US Northwest because of that experience.
And that beautifully brings me into the next thing that I really want to understand is when you came, it was your first time here, you were married. I can understand that usually it's like, if you have friends that emigrated here, maybe, but when you come married, like your husband's your partner. And so, you kind of have that ready-made, hopefully a healthy ready-made, which I think it is, like good partnership, right when you came up with that. So if you can remember, like when you first came and you were just kind of doing your thing and you were getting to know, what was going through your mind and your heart? Like, what was that process?
I think I was, I was Portland, where we were living, was a very quiet place. And Bangalore, where I came from, was this bustling town. And I was in the middle of a big village always. I was surrounded by people. I knew so many people, and then to come to a place where you don't know anyone, complete clean slate. It was pretty depressing, because I came in December 31st, I still remember, and it was cold and raining and there was nobody on the streets, and because it is a suburb of Portland. And then I remember asking my husband, where are all the people? It's 31st evening, like New Year's Eve, and there's no one on the roads. And he's like, it's so cold, what do you want them to do? In India, in Bangalore, 31st night would be this bustling thing, So it took me a while to understand that people don't really walk on roads and stuff like that. I'm like, I had seen New York, and I was like, all of US is like New York. And then I come to Portland, I'm like, no, not really. So it took me a while to kind of get my own people. I always was very certain that I always wanted my own set of friends. I mean, we had like common friends and all that, but I wanted my own identity. And I got really lucky in, finding my clique in school, and I still am in touch with them. And so that really helped me sort of acclimatize and get encultured into the American big culture.
Yeah. And so when you mentioned that it was depressing, it was a little lonely, and I understand that, I understand
Yeah.
that. And the education can be such a brilliant bridge.
Yeah, it was.
Brilliant bridge. So talk a little bit more about when you first went to your class and the friends that you made. Like, what was that process like?
It was actually quite seamless, I think, because I think it's also my personality. I've never actually felt conscious or fearful of voicing my thoughts. And we were always encouraged to do that, even in grad school. And I think for many people there was a stereotype of an Indian woman who's sort of diffident and sort of reserved, and I was so not that. And in my 20s, in fact, I was a little bit more defiant and badass. So I was like cussing everybody out, and we're like, who is this person? I have to give credit to my professors who sort of took me for what I am and didn't really try to confirm, because I think it was also a liberal arts program. I don't know how it would be if I went to any other more, confirmed study. They were all liberal. We were all studying about socialism and, defying the norms. And, so I fit right in. It was like, oh my God, where have you been all my life?
So were there any moments, and even actually if we want to go back to, and well, actually before we go back to your teenage years in India and then come back, just stepping into a new environment and the adjustment coding that happens with that starts to build a level of resiliency and almost.
It totally does.
So
it totally does.
Can you chat a little bit more about how that life experience of coming in and integrating with the culture and the friends, like how did, how did that exactly move you into developing a greater baseline or changing the baseline of resiliency and strength that you very clearly had from a very young age?
I think, one is, I would say that I think early childhood is like one of the most foundation layers of anybody's resilience. And I think, there's a lot of research that sort of has confirmed what I've felt or sort of embodied. Because I think when you're very certain of the value that you bring, or the who you are, or that you're sort of comfortable in who you are, in your own skin, as they say, you are not sort of traumatized or moved by external circumstances or external changes. So I did know that that I do bring a certain level of thought or whatever, or value to the program. For example, when I went into Portland, and I enjoy bringing that, and I enjoy learning from other people. So also resilience is about being flexible. So I knew that if I have to do well, or change how I study, how I speak up or not speak up. I mean, even the cultural coding of, not sitting in a certain way in an American classroom, the nonverbal behavior. I mean, in India, we're all supposed to sit straight with our spine erect, with our vision straight, and, not eat anything, feet down, always paying attention, giving eye contact. Whereas when I came here, I saw that, the students were doing whatever they wanted. Some even had like earphones back then. And then they were chewing gum, or they were even eating or having a drink, and that was like, oh my God, I mean, isn't that disrespectful? Why, so it took me a while, even for me, when I became a teacher, to be okay with all that. And then I sort of use that as a meta learning, like, see, this is the cultural code that we think of as normative, and we think is normal, but it's actually just the social construct of what is told is acceptable versus not acceptable. Yeah. So that and then just like I said, the diversity of experiences that one is exposed to living in a culture like India sort of sets you up in many ways for being more resilient, and in your own going back and forth between different cultural codes when you move away from India.
Yeah, that's a very key thing that I'm not sure, we were talking about this earlier, a lot of people don't realize how diverse India is.
Because in terms of religion itself, just take one variable, right? There are about 6 major religions, right? Yeah. And then within each religion, there are so many sub-groups, sub-castes, criteria to belong in a certain group, or you're not from a certain group. So just that one variable of religion, plus you add to it language, and there are about 25 languages, and then various dialects. Yeah. So my neighbors in India, none of us spoke the same language. The common language that we had was English, and which people don't realize that, English is a common language. English is a national language because of colonialism by the British. So I did have a few moments of racist and ignorant people asking me about my English, for example, and stereotyping. Yeah. I feel like as a brown woman, we are often given that sort of microaggressive comment of, oh, you speak English so well. Oh, you're not a typical Indian. What the hell is a typical Indian?
Exactly.
You know? So how many Indians do you know to know what a typical Indian is? You know?
What the hell does that even mean? Nobody even knows what that means because it doesn't exist.
Exactly. So those, but then you also sort of build in, right? As a person of color and as an immigrant, you build in certain set of responses, even within. And then, of course, externally, how do you engage with people who do that to you?
So can you chat a little bit about an experience or many that, you experienced that microaggression of just being just being brown, like your skin tone, and you start talking and your English is beautiful and people are like, oh, well, can we talk a little bit, like maybe one or two moments?
Oh yeah, I mean, I still remember that I was in the cafeteria in Portland, and my friend and I, Jennifer, and she's white, and she was with me, and she's a Portland, Portland native, and we used to have lunch every day. And then, so there was this person who came, and she was asking us whether there was another chair in our table, and she's like, can she take the chair? And so I answered, and I said, yeah, you can. I mean, it's only the two of us. And so she doesn't even look at me. She again looks at Jen, and she's like, can I take it? And Jen is like, but she just said that you can. And so she looks at me again, and she's like, oh, you said I didn't understand it. And then she sort of slows down her speech to me as if I'm the one who's not understanding, and speaks really loudly, and as if I can't hear, cannot hear in the noise or whatever. And that was her way of saying that, oh, you are somebody different. And maybe she had this thing that I don't know, either I don't know English, or that I don't have the authority to say you can take the chair. She sort of deferred it to my friend who's white. And so many such moments happen with people who are strangers. Once you get to know people, I think then the degree of stereotyping kind of goes down. Yeah. Even though you do get all sorts of offset comments about Indians or immigrants or whatever. Or going in a bus, people don't sit next to you sometimes. And then I used to never really look at it too much. I'm like, yeah, whatever, I'm good, I get another seat, Yeah. I don't care, do whatever. But then you look at it, and then I see that for younger people, and if you do not have that sort of a thing built in about who you are, it can be very hurtful, and it is hurtful in many ways. So you have to sort of build your reservoir of your centeredness, if there is that word, to interact with some of that in this culture.
It's like that, being grounded within your own self and knowing what your identity is, who you want your identity to be, who you are from your heart, and letting that lead the way. It sounds like is where you begin to understand which cultural coding to integrate or move in with, and which cultural coding is really not for you.
Exactly. And then you realize, Rajni, that this I know in my 40s, that I didn't know when I was in my 20s, but I think it came naturally to me on hindsight, that I realized that you only can interact and you can only deal with an X amount of something. After you can either have conflict or question only an X amount of something. Otherwise, you're constantly in conflict, and you're constantly hitting your head over something. And how much of that energy do you want to do? And where do you want to affect change? You sort of focus on that particular area.
Yeah.
You hone into that.
Yeah, it's a constant friction that you have to make a decision for yourself. How much do you want to keep carrying? Yeah,
exactly.
And this brings me to actually, it reminded me of a moment I had when I was with my girlfriend, and she had when I say girlfriend, like one of my really close friends, and she's white skinned, beautiful blonde hair. She's from you think I know this? She's a close friend of mine. I think she's from Slovakia, and she had a beautiful son, and I was sitting at the pool with her, and another person came and sat down and, just started chatting with us. And the woman doesn't ask me. She asked my friends, like, oh, is she your nanny? Like about me. And I was like, come again? And I
Yeah.
just remember, so, and my friend was like,
Mortified.
my friend felt insulted. She was like,
Yeah.
what? And then I was like, I remember in that moment saying, can you help me understand why you think I'm her nanny? You know, because I wanted to have that dialogue, right? She got really uncomfortable, ended up leaving, but I'm like, I'm open for a conversation if you want to. So anyway, that's
Yeah.
a whole sphere.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so now I want to talk a little bit, and I think it's okay if we skip the teenage years just for a moment, because I want to get into, you know, you're here, you're settled, you're building a family, all of these things are happening. Tell me about, you had cancer.
Yes. At 37.
37,
Yeah.
very young age.
Yeah.
You were diagnosed with cancer.
Yes.
Before that diagnosis came,
Yeah.
and you ended up, and I'm assuming you had doctor appointments and you had everything, and you were talking to your husband. What was that time like for you?
So I was 37, and I had written in my, my medical records that I may have had an aunt who has breast cancer, but I wasn't sure because back in India, back then, and she had passed away when I was very young. Back in India, nobody knew what kind of cancer, but she kind of had something and she passed away. So I'd written that, and then my doctor, God bless her, she was like, "You need to go get tested because the rule in the medical thing is that 10 years before the age of the diagnosis of your of a first degree relative, if there's a diagnosis of cancer, you get tested for cancer." And I was 37, so my baseline mammogram was supposed to be done on my 40th birthday. But my doctor was like, "Why didn't you just go get your baseline mammogram done? Because, it's just something you go do when you're done and you don't have to do it again." So that was it. My baseline mammogram showed in what's it called, microcalcifications, and then I was diagnosed with a stage 0 cancer called as a ductal carcinoma in situ, which means the cancer was in my milk ducts. I was a young mother. I had my son who was 4, who was 5, 6 that time, and 6, and then my daughter who was 3. So I had 2 young children, and I was devastated. The world got pulled under from me because nobody expects. I was pretty healthy. I was always a very physically, like, none of the risk factors they say was what I did. So my risk factor was that smoking. I did not smoke. I did drink occasionally, but eventually I found out that my aunt was not diagnosed with breast cancer. She was diagnosed with something else. And it was just one of those quirks of the universe that made me even go to get my mammogram. So I decided to do a bilateral mastectomy, which was pretty radical. But because at that time, which was like, now it is 10 years ago, I decided to do that because I knew that I did not want to have that hanging over me with a young family, to go back and get tested every day, every week, every month. And, I just did not want that. And since it was such a young age diagnosis, I was told that this is a better way to not better way, but acceptable way to reduce chances of it recurring. So that's what I did. And it was pretty devastating until I found out. So I remember one of my darkest period it was a stage of 10 days, was when they told me that I had microcalcifications, but they didn't know what it was. So we had to do like multiple testing of, biopsies and all that, ultrasounds and all that stuff, till they actually told me what it was. So there were 10 days. It was a long, protracted 10 days, because it usually is not so, but it was just something that happened. And until I figured out what it was, I was terrified. Once I figured out what it was, and that there is this way to do this, and it's not going to be like fatal or terminal. It felt better that I could do it, and I could do like a mastectomy and a reconstruction, and then be a mother, do this thing. So yeah, and as soon as I finished my reconstruction, I wanted to jump right into motherhood, because that I didn't want to lose my time with my children. So I went in and I got into a biggest SUV right after my. I'm like, I'm going to drive all of you to Oregon. So from California, we drove to Oregon, and I drove. I'm like, I can drive, and I can do this, and I can do that. So it was this sort of adrenaline rush. It was a high that I was in, because I was like, you're always sort of in a protective mode with your children. You're in a reactive mode at that time. Hindsight and a lot of yoga has changed how I think about it, but I don't think I acknowledged my grief until much later. And
before we get into the grief, I want to touch on that 10-day period.
Yeah.
And the reason why I want to kind of sink into the 10-day period is because it's important. So we're going to talk more about how you move through it. We've already talked a little bit about that. But during those 10 days, I think it's important for people also to understand and to hear mentally, emotionally, physically, like what was happening to you when you were seeped into those 10 days, which probably felt like 10 years.
Fear. It's raw fear. It's raw fear because you feel without any control. And as a teacher for people with cancer, now I teach people with cancer. So, and I counsel people who are newly diagnosed. And I feel that the biggest thing that we can help people who are diagnosed recently is to give us a sense of control, because we feel like there is no control over our bodies. That's the biggest thing, because it's almost visceral, and it's reflective in so many ways. Insomnia, for example, like anxiety. I was never prone to a lot of anxiety, but definitely insomnia. Couldn't sleep, and always wanting to research on my own, because I also had that undergrad microbiology, that sort of science thing. I'm like, okay, give me the data, tell me what I can do, and analyze the crap out of it, and talk to everybody. I mean, I collected data. I talked to one of my best friends who was a doctor, and I think that is really a big part of that resilience building, is to have these people, these voices in your head, who become the voices in your head, form a sort of sisterhood around you. That helps to build resilience. I think that helped me a lot. I knew that there were people who had my back. My doctors, I trusted my doctors. I only go with people who I trust. So I knew that everybody was looking out for me. So that was a good feeling. But there was raw fear for those 10 days. And I will not do anybody a disservice in saying that was not scary. It was scary. Yeah.
Do you remember if you recall how the physical body reacted to it? I'm curious about that.
I mean, it is about 10 years ago. So, but then I think for me, it was always something I feel fear in my stomach. Okay. That sort of holding of the stomach. But there are different that people react to fear differently. Some people feel, get the cold sweat or the heart beating. That has also happened a few times. So physical symptoms of fear are different for different people. But for me, it was basically, I think, breath holding and that's that thing in the stomach, that pit in the stomach,
And the reason why I'm asking for that is because someone who may be watching this may think, oh shit, maybe I do need to think about this a little bit more. Oh shit, I get that all the time. Let me explore that instead of staying in that discomfort all the time. That's kind of the reason I wanted to sink into your 10 days for people to feel like, I mean, this is shit,
It was not easy. And I think, as there's a glorification that happens with people who are survivors and who are people who have gone through cancer, and I try not to be that. people say, oh my gosh, you're a role model, or you went through cancer and now you're teaching people with cancer. But I that's not what we should do with people who are gone through trauma, because there is a sort of courage, yes, for sure, certain, that every human has a reservoir of courage. uh, some of us have it because of our other life experiences, or in India they say the past life karma, or whatever it is, right? So but by making somebody up into like this pedestal of a hero or a heroine, you're taking away the humanity, and you are not giving that person's human experience all the colors. And so I say fear is a very natural experience for any human to feel, that one doesn't have control over your body, and one has to acknowledge that, and one has to be aware of how your body is reacting to certain things, and then see how you can respond to it.
And now how do you react to fear?
Much differently. And I think that's because of my yoga practice and age and experience. I mean, I've been through one experience of feeling that I had no control, and I know how that feels. Now I know what I need to do. And so when the pandemic happened, for example, or pandemic is happening, for example, and I knew that, that certain things may be triggering in not only my brain, but also people who, like me, who had cancer, for example, or any chronic illness which has been life-threatening. And then here is something else which is on top of that. So I would say treat ourselves with a great deal of gentleness and self-compassion and rest, and be unabashedly vulnerable.
Gotcha. So when you say treat ourselves with gentleness, self-compassion, in terms of mental thoughts and then in terms of physical action, what does that look like?
Slowing it down, if you can, or at least have periods in your day which you can slow it down. Slow down the nervous system, because the nervous system is in fight, flight, freeze, all, because of all the stuff that's happening around us, right? We're being bombarded with a lot of intense information, and which are critical pieces of information for our everyday life and for those who we love around us. So I would say slowing it down is the number one thing you can do to help your nervous system to be regulated. And it can look as something as simple as having rituals through the day to kind of help you to be in your body. Having a cup of tea in silence, or going outside and taking a walk if you have an access to a backyard or a park or something like that, being in nature, slowing down your stimulus.
Gotcha. And is that, so when we talk about the mental and then we talk about the physical and having that gentleness, just like you're saying, let's go specific to your practices. What do you do specifically in those two arenas?
I do exactly what I said. I do. I go every day in the morning. I do not look at my phone till like 9:30. I go outside, have a cup of chai, listen to the birds. We are blessed here in California, and try to see how, I mean, this sounds very hokey maybe, but really gratitude has shown to rewire your brain. The neurology of gratitude is that you're building pathways in your brain to say, wow, I have whatever I have, like people in my life or access to resources or whatever it is. So just kind of dwell on that a little bit, and dwell on be more present in your body, in your breath. So that's my golden rule that I do every day. And of course, moving your body in a way which is helpful to you, not in a competitive way, not in a ableist way, not in a performative way, but being in yourself, however you are, in a way which gives you joy. which helps you connect with where you are in your body.
And I think you've touched on this already, but when you look at all of these experiences that you've had, and the moment when the practice of yoga came in definitively for you, when you look at that whole sphere of experience and the experience and influence of these different yogic practices and philosophies, if you didn't have yoga and the philosophies and all that, what do you think would have happened, or what do you think you would have used instead?
Maybe dance.
Okay.
Maybe dance, because it's, again, I was always a very physical person growing up. That I've always looked at my body as a means of being joyful and expressive. So I still went back to that. Went back as an adult, and I learned dance and with my daughter, and that's something that has connected me and her. So dance definitely, hopefully, would have continued and hope to continue.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so if you think now, in the next 10 years, so let me actually take a step back. So I want to touch a little bit on the current state in the US right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, with representation that is being demanded now in the yoga field, the physical yoga field, as I call it. And all these kinds of things. Where do you land in terms of your inherent building of strength and how you look at all of these current events happening? How do you feel about all of this? And
I think this was a long moment of reckoning that has been waiting to happen, and I hope we never lose momentum. I think Black Lives Matter is a moment that has been worked on by millions of Black lives historically, and I think I'm thinking that my hope is that we use this moment to actually build change in in a systemic way and a systematic way, not just in terms of protesting, but actually changing policy, underlying institutions of healthcare or education or housing or so things like that in everyday life.
yeah, and I agree. And I think that's why it's important to keep having the conversation, keep going, keep checking in, okay, did this policy reform actually happen? It didn't happen. What do we do to get there? So I think that's all the continuation. And then when you look at the South Asian culture, when you look at, and when I say South Asian culture, actually, let me just take a step back. When you look at, you emigrated here to do your master's, or after you got married, you did your master's. And so coming from that sphere, and now as you are within the US culture, and you've created your own coding, coding for all of this. When you look at how, the perception of being Black as it applies to the Indian communities in India and being here, what are some of your thoughts about that, and what needs to shift and change within that paradigm?
So in terms of colorism, you mean, or?
Colorism, yeah. We know in India, it's like the big thing is like, you need to be whiter. You need to be whiter. Yeah. Like, all the Fair and Lovely cream ads and stuff that we kind of grew up with. Specific to, I would say, just within the communities, it's like, if you have darker skin, you're Indian, but you have darker skin, you're more brown, or you're even darker, it can be seen as like a negative.
Yes.
Cultural from the colonialist kind of situation and prior. So looking at kind of how we approach within our own, communities of being brown, being Indian, and what we already deal with our own people.
Yeah.
How do you feel that translates or should be looked at when we look at the Black community as it relates to the Indian communities?
I think there is a strong correlation, or not a correlation is a wrong word, but casteism in India is a truth that nobody talks about. the Dalit lives matter movement. There is nobody who's talking anything about those things. And back now in India, and I'm going to say this openly, there is a militarization almost of yoga, for example. And so those are the things that we really need to watch out for. And then making sure that we are amplifying Dalit lives. We are, helping other and shining a light on activists in the Dalit movement, and understanding how their voices have been silenced violently and socially, culturally throughout history, and that racism is the Western cousin of casteism in India, and we cannot be blind to that. And as yoga practitioners, in my belief system is that social justice work or racial justice work is the very heart of what yoga is about. Even from the Yoga Sutras perspective, the 8 limbs of yoga, talking first is the ahimsa, and ahimsa is not being passive. It means you're actively stopping violence. So you're an active voice against violence in your own way. You don't have to be like, all sort of in the frontline activists, but how are you preventing violence from happening in your community immediately? So there's a lot of ways that the Black Lives Matter movement, I hope, can shine a light on other oppressed groups all over the world. And of course, I hope that happens, more and more in India too.
Yeah, for sure. All of this is very complicated, and yet with simple solutions, and yet humanity makes it more complicated. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Very fascinating.
It is. And it's not easy, and nothing is easy. We are talking about centuries and thousands of years of oppression and systems that have been in place because it has benefited some very big groups of people, and to overturn that or to change that will not happen in maybe even my lifetime or your lifetime. But that doesn't mean we give up. That means that we keep at it, keep chipping away at it in our own ways, in our own families and communities, and our work. So my work right now is sort of shifted to, and I think it was always going in that trajectory. And now I think the world around is sort of helping me propel more toward integrating social justice work with my yoga teaching.
Yeah, I love that. So, and on that note, I know that I'm going to be talking to you a lot, because I think there is a lot of wonderful things that you are bringing out to the world and to the community, and necessary things, necessary conversations, the importance of critical thinking skills, necessary understandings, or rather reflections on yogic philosophy. There's a lot of beautiful things you're doing, and we'll make a note of that under the video as well, and we'll make a note of that so people can find you. And you're already doing some wonderful things in your teachings as well. So on that note, Anjali, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Any last things you want to mention?
No, I think the work of Yoga Service Council and the very fact that there's a word service in there has my stamp of approval.
Thank you. We're stepping into our new decade, and there's a lot of new things that we like to do, and part of it is bringing in representation in what we're doing, bringing in representation and having conversations. So that, this Yoga and Resilience series is not something that we're doing now. It's something that will live longer and have its own evolution as we look at racial justice and systemic changes. Like you said, it's a long freaking time coming. Mm-hmm. A lot of these things. And I agree. I don't think it'll happen in either of our generations. But the hope is by the time that your kids come to, they're in their late 40s and 50s, at least there's a difference enough where the history books will finally write about it.
Exactly. Well said.
All right, Anjali. Well, thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you so much for connecting with us here at the Yoga and Resilience series with Anjali Rao. You will find all the information about her, where she teaches, what she does, and all her fantastic programming underneath this YouTube video. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.